Hi, I'm Pam Blizzard from Recovered Peace.
And I'm Lachelle Burkett with Hope Redefined.
And I'm Bonnie Burns of Strong Wives. We're so glad you're joining us. I just want to make note that this episode around the topic of grief runs a little long, so I'd invite you to put this on playback speed of about 1.5 so that you can finish it by the time you reach the grocery store. Today, we are discussing how grief plays a part in our healing from the impact of sexual betrayal. And as I've mentioned in previous podcasts, when the main person in your life betrays you, he murders the trust you had in him. Neurologically, your brain does not know the difference between the death of a person and the death of trust. So the same process that brings about healing from the death of a loved one is the same process that brings about healing after the death of trust. It's painful, messy, and oftentimes doesn't make sense. So ladies, let's just talk initially here about the definition of grief.
Processing, accepting, making meaning of your loss.
I think in the beginning, if you would have said to me, what's the definition of grief? I would have used words like weakness, unnecessary, overdramatic, something I feared. As I have healed myself, but also walk with so many women through that process. Vicky Tiede has a phrase in her book that says, grief is the clotting system that helps a broken heart stop bleeding. I remember reading that for the first time in her book and being like, oh man, because I knew exactly what it felt like to have a broken heart that was bleeding. And I was desperate for it to stop. But I didn't like that she said grief was the component, because that part scared me.
And for me, a simple definition of grief is homesickness. Grief for me was a longing for all things to be right again, which was my definition of home. My home base had exploded and I was homesick. So what were some of your personal experiences around grief due to the betrayal?
This has been an ongoing space that I feel like God has consistently been bringing me back to in the right seasons. It wasn't an end-all be-all in the beginning. And I do think that's important for our listeners to recognize. But for myself, in the beginning, I don't think I grieved. I don't think I even recognized that there was a need for grief. I really picked up, he was the one that was struggling and he needed an encourager and someone to stand by his side. If I was hurting, I recognized somehow in my brain that I couldn't be in both places at the same time. I couldn't be grieving and also being a cheerleader. So one of those had to go. So I guess I unconsciously made the decision to not entertain grief. And I went towards being the encourager because I believe that's what was going to get us through this storm, earthquake. But I think that as the years continued, and in my particular story, there were slips and relapses. And I think that's when grief was a really difficult emotion for me to process. I had a lot of fear with grief. I also had a lot of stinking thinking about grief and how it didn't have any value or purpose. It was like, I remember the phrase that would go through my mind is, what's it matter? It won't change anything anyway, right? So it was grief added to the hopelessness. It wasn't going to change anything. So why would I bother doing it? It didn't come out as grief. It came out as rage. It came out as anxiety. It came out in depression. It came out as, well, I've even had developments of autoimmune diseases and disorders since then. It went somewhere. Even if I wasn't willing to let it hang out with me, it went somewhere.
For me, I was grieving, but I didn't know I was grieving. I was in this dark, hollow place that didn't make sense. I almost didn't want it to make sense because that meant I had to accept what was happening. And every fiber of my being did not want to accept. It wasn't until somebody told me that I was grieving, that these feelings were normal, this process was necessary for my healing, and that I wouldn't always feel the same way. The way I grieved would change. It would morph on grieving. And it was confusing because I started grieving in a place where before I had full disclosure, and I didn't even know what I was grieving. So I didn't have my reality. And that made it harder for me because it just added to the confusion. And it was before I had joined a group. So I was very much isolated. We often talk about when you go through this, it is like a death, and nobody knocks on your door with a casserole. Nobody offers to do your grocery shopping for you. I was very much isolated in my grief. I didn't know where to take it. My therapist, you get an hour a week or every 2 weeks, and my therapist only had so much time to work on grief with me. And so it was, in the beginning, it was horrible before I knew what it was or it had a purpose. And I think once somebody was able to give me some structure or some hope that it would change and it wouldn't always be this way, and that it would be okay if I fell apart, because I was afraid to fall apart because I didn't know how to put myself back together again. So in the beginning, it can be very, very scary when you don't really know that you're grieving.
And my experience is very similar in that it was a process to come to a place to understand that grief is what you have to go through to start to reach some healing. In the very beginning, I accepted his blame around his acting out. I accepted his blame because I wasn't showing up in the bedroom as much as he would have liked. So instead of even thinking about grief, I immediately started working on myself. How can I fix me? I'm the problem, so I'm the solution. That's something that I could easily wrap my mind around. So, okay, let's do this. Put on my walking shoes. Let's go. I worked on that for a long time and thought we got to a place of I was successful in reaching that place of I was no longer the low drive wife. And then after that second discovery, when I had done all the things and my world exploded the second time, there still wasn't as much support in my world. I didn't know where the support was. So no one was helping me understand the processes with boundaries and those type of things. Those were still kind of terms I was still coming to understand. So there wasn't grief after that second one either. But there was a beginning of identity development after that second one. I was going to understand who I was, because this obviously isn't about me if he keeps doing it, and I fixed all the things. But the third time is when grief set in, and I found support quickly, and I found that grief is a necessary part of finding your way out of it. My experience was that when grief set in, I felt like I was being sucked into a black hole, that there was nothing there. It was a void. That's where I was going. I was disappearing. One thing stuck in my head. The thing that stuck in my head is that God sees me. God sees me. He won't let this destroy me. And it was that pulled me through the grief process. Am I done grieving? No. I don't know if any betrayed wife really ever gets done grieving, but I am on the other side of the worst of it. And that was my experience. So now that you've heard what our experiences are, we're going to talk about what some of our clients, or just women in general who've been betrayed, some of the things they might experience around grief. So ladies, just share what you've seen or have learned through your training around grief.
Well, I got a chance to actually participate in the Connection Summit with Daring Ventures and Dr. Jake Porter in 2021. I got to talk about this particular subject and about grief after betrayal. And as I was trying to prepare for that conversation, I really began to recognize there's an avoidance that a lot of us have around grief. I was curious. I just got really curious about avoidance. Like, what is that about? I was able to come up with these 4 areas or ways that I've consistently seen some of my friends, my clients, my group members wrestle through the emotions of grief. And you guys have already spoken to some of them. So I think it's very applicable. So the first one was permission. And that was a huge part of my story. I heard Pam talk about how she got permission in her group. And a lot of women that's one of the things that we miss. We talk about going to someone's funeral or a celebration of life and having your community around you in the aftermath of a loss, in essence, gives you permission to be sad. It gives you permission to call in sick to work the next day. It gives you permission to step off the PTO for a season or being room mom. It gives you permission to call a friend to pick your kids up from school. Having that kind of reality that your community knows there's been a loss, people are willing to step in. We were talking earlier about a colleague of ours, Kim Petroni, who writes a blog called Not a Casserole Widow. That's kind of one of her first blog posts was about the loss and of her marriage and her story, and no one brought her a casserole. Part of the reason I see a lot of women struggle with that, and myself, is that we didn't realize there was permission to do this. The number one place that you can gain permission to grieve is in group communities. But also getting with getting with a coach or a clinician who understands betrayal trauma and knows that this is such a vital step when it comes to a woman's healing. The next reason we avoid is because of fear. And I thought this was really interesting. Brene Brown, I have a quote from her that says, "We fear the emotion of grief more than any other emotion." And these are some of the lies that we have believed for ourselves or have heard others say. And I'm just going to read some of these phrases because I think we could really connect with them. The first one is, if I let myself feel sadness or pain, it will only make it worse. If I let myself acknowledge my grief, I'll never be able to function again. It will engulf me. Or I've heard women say consume, overwhelm, drown. There's a lot of that anxiety that comes with just going under. Another one is, I don't have time to grieve. I don't have time for sadness. Another one, I think I need to think positively and not dwell on the bad or the pain. The pain from my grief will be so painful, I will not sustain under it. So it's going to crush me. If I let myself grieve, I'm just having a pity party for myself. Yeah, that one hurts me so bad when I hear women say that. I don't need to have a pity party. I'm like, this is not a pity party. This is a legit loss. If I cry about this, I'm weak and I have to be strong right now. And I hear a lot of women when they have to navigate separation, or maybe it's even like there's a financial betrayal attached with it, about the being strong right now, because there potentially is more than one crisis happening for her. She's got the betrayal and the infidelity, and then she also has additional chaos that comes with this. Grief only comes when someone dies, and no one has died. Therefore, I shouldn't be in pain. And the last one that I had in the list was, something's wrong with me because it's been this much time, in quotes, this much time, and I'm still sad about this. I remember asking a client that. She's like, well, I should be. It's been 3 years. I should be past this by now. And I finally just asked her the question, who said that to you? And she got real quiet for a second. She goes, I don't know. And I said, yeah, I don't know either, but they were not very nice but my guess is she said it to herself, right? She had an expectation that it wouldn't look like this 3 years later. And I'm not saying that woman was grieving for 3 years. The reality was she wasn't grieving at all, but the grief was still had an undercurrent inside of her soul. And that's what she was still feeling. It wasn't processed. It was just still lingering. So there's 2 more. The other reason I hear women avoid is because they don't believe it has a purpose. And then the 4th one is even from a spiritual standpoint. Like I hear a lot of women in the faith community who get lost or stuck. Well, I see a lot of them wrestle even with being with God, with Jesus, when they're grieving, because they're messy and they don't know how to do messy with God. And grief feels messy and out of control. And so there's this miss or this avoidance because they don't understand the spiritual purpose of grief.
You talked about the purpose of grief. And I think Andrew J. Bauman, this is a quote from him, Stumbling Towards Wholeness. This is a wonderful quote that sort of sums this up beautifully. He says, grief serves as a shovel for the soul. It digs, mines, and excavates painfully at times, violently, but deep love enters those very same spaces. If we never allow ourselves to feel the pain of loss and betrayal, we will not feel the fullness of love. And I think that so beautifully illustrates that in our grief, we are honoring what we lost, the very beautiful things and of love and honesty and loyalty and connection and the sense of who we are in relationship with our husband. Those are beautiful, sacred things. And in that grief, we give honor to those beautiful things. Unless we go through that process of holding it up to the light and holding it this way and that way and looking at these things through the different lenses, we're not able to honor those things within us.
So if I could add about the very real physical pain that you can feel with grief, because I have clients who are grappling with, I just hurt. Everywhere hurts. It's not just my emotions and my heart. My body hurts. And this is something that's really happening. It's not psychosomatic. It's not you're making this pain up. It really is happening because in your brain, the place where rejection lives is very close to where physical pain lives. So there's a neural cross wiring there. So when you experience rejection and betrayal is the, epitome of rejection. And when you experience that, you can feel physical pain. It's not in your head. It's really happening. The way to get out of that physical pain is through the process of grief. For some hope, mine lasted about 9 months. The true physical pain in the pit of it was kind of between my heart and my stomach. It was just in my core. But I have other friends who are experiencing the same thing. And I just want to give you hope. It won't last forever. But it is grief. It is part of the process of healing. Another thing I would like to bring up is that no matter what your husband's acting out behaviors have been, there is a spectrum of behaviors, and they go from 0 to 100, let's say. Wherever he lands on that spectrum does not indicate the greater or least amount of pain you are going to experience. It's all the same. Betrayal is betrayal. The death of trust is the death of trust, whether it was on the low end of the spectrum or the high end of the spectrum. And the problem with that is when we judge ourselves over, it's not that bad, we're cutting off our pathway to healing because we're saying, we don't have anything to grieve about. No, you do. It's okay to say, this is a big deal and I'm going to grieve over it. So I just wanted to give some encouragement there that if you're receiving a message in your environment, in your social world that's saying, it's not that bad, reject that. The loss of trust is the loss of trust, no matter how it came about.
Yeah, and there's this saying in the recovery community that all trauma is trauma. You can't compare. Your wounds are important and valid and deserve to be seen and heard and healed. Please don't compare. Again, there's that self-judgment. Don't judge where you should be or you shouldn't be. You are where you are.
Yeah, and I think that can also come with comparing stories too, because we get in the groups and we share our story, and there's the temptation to say, well, at least he didn't do X, Y, and Z, and that's not helpful. So in doing that, you're kind of gaslighting yourself. You're minimizing it. You're invalidating your experience. What's happened is real and true, and whether you get a casserole or not, there is a death.
I'll also add that comparison is a scheme of the enemy. He comes to steal, kill, and destroy. That's it. John 10:10 is very clear about that. And so if he can disrupt your ability to feel like you belong to a community or a support group, he'll do it. I watch women jump in our groups And like, this is the first time their chests have probably taken the deepest breath ever, or for a really long time. They're just like, it's finally, I get to do this. And they're so grateful. And then you can just watch it and you're like, no, 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 no. Like, we try to call it out, say what it is, but there's still that wrestle that the enemy does not want us to get well, right? That's his strategy as well, is to keep us in bondage. And being able to grieve, being able to share our truth, being able to be in community with one another, receive encouragement, all of those are resulting in essence and feelings of freedom. And so he's gonna shut that down as fast as possible. So
This was an eye opener for me, and aha. This came from, again, Jake Porter, that he said there is a difference between triggers and grief waves. And that was helpful for me to understand what I was experiencing. A lot of times I would say, I'm so triggered, I'm having a trigger right now, but it really wasn't like a neurological trauma trigger, but I had this big heaviness to the point where I just felt so disempowered. And it was a grief wave. A luxury that a grieving brain needs is safety. So if you're not able to grieve and you're in a situation where your partner isn't necessarily a safe person for you yet, or you haven't built that up with your partner, this is where, again, group can be so helpful. Group can be a very safe space. I have heard so many women trying to hold it together in group and say, I'm sorry. And we're like, no, this is the place to fall apart. This is the place where we get it. There'll be no judgment. We've been there. If you need to fall apart, this is the place to do it. And often they'll say, I'm afraid if I do, I won't be able to stop. And we're like, no, it's okay. It's all right. This is the safe place to do it. So if you need a safe place to fully express your grief.
I have a question that I'd like to propose to the two of you. I think it would be helpful for our listeners to have an answer to this question. What are they grieving?
I'm grieving my identity as a woman who had a husband who never cheated on me. I used to take pride in that. That used to give me a sense of security. That was part of my identity. I was no longer that person. I didn't know how to be a woman whose husband who had cheated on her. Didn't know how to do it. I was grieving me, the loss of me.
I think more specifically, I was grieving my sexual identity because I had worked on that really hard and it wasn't respected. So that was shattered. So how do I put that back together again? How do I be a sexual being again when all of this mess involves my sexuality, the defilement of my marriage bed? How do I put that back together? And I had to grieve that before I could put it back together.
And I can relate to that specifically too, in terms of, hey, I'd worked on this in relapse. I was grieving the trust that I extended after the first betrayal. Really? I extended this trust to you out of grace and graciousness and a desire to be a forgiving person and all the things. And so I was grieving the decisions I had made to do that in relapse.
Mm-hmm. I was also grieving who I thought my husband was.
Yes.
Because now, as I've gotten farther along the journey, I see that some things were truly who he was.
Mm-hmm.
But I had to grieve the parts that I didn't know about, that I had to put into my reality. It was kind of a reverse grief. It wasn't something I lost. It was something I learned. And learning that caused a lot of grief.
I'm grieving the fairy tale of what I thought my life was and was going to be. So I was grieving my past. I was grieving my present. I was grieving my future. Because now all of that changed.
I really grieved authenticity for myself. because one of the things that was a loss for me in my journey was I remember going into church. I'd gone into our community group. It was kind of known at this point that this was what was going on in our marriage. And I remember a girl in the community group asking me how I was. And I answered her question. I was like, I'm not good. I'm falling apart. I don't know what to do with myself. Blah, 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 right. And I'm sure most of our listeners they were like, oh yeah, the woman who backed away slowly, that was her. Right. But what it was it was yet another experience of rejection. And I'm not blaming her for that. I know that she was just as overwhelmed as I was, but on the backside of it, what it was communicating to me was, you can't show up here how you really are. And so I lost that sense of authenticity. There was also parts of this in the early stages of just fear of like, how would people view my husband or judge him? So I would keep things quiet or not necessarily tell everybody. And that caused me to lose a sense of authenticity because that was a really strong, and it is still a strong value for me. In the last year, I have had several women who have joined groups with us who are engaged. Maybe the engagement was broken off. My heart breaks for their stories because the one thing I had, one of the gals and I talked, and she said, it's really difficult because right now I'm grieving what I thought was coming. And she goes, while I had not walked down the aisle yet, I was his wife. Like I had made a heart covenant with him already before that day ever happened, which meant I was planning our future together. And then this exposure, this rupture happens in their relationship. They call off the marriage. And now she's grieving. And a lot of her community is just like, it's just a breakup. Get over with, get it over with, whatever. And there's a minimization or just obviously a misunderstanding. And I said to her, it's interesting because in this girl's particular situation, it was about a month before the wedding, right? She had her dress. She had the invitations out. It was on, right? They were just counting down the days. And I said, the interesting thing is that this happened 3 weeks before marriage. And had this happened 3 weeks after your wedding, they would be telling you to fight for the marriage. They would tell you to fight for that relationship and help him get better. And I said, and yet I'm pretty certain that the same people are now saying, let it go. Because there's a misunderstanding there in that dynamic of relationship. And I just I'm so thankful for these girls, women, right? They're women, teaching me even more empathy in this area of grief and loss. So I just thought, man, I need to share that story with our listeners today, just so they have that other perspective. Like if they've got a friend who's lost an engagement, she's probably grieving because she planned on having kids with this guy, right? There was nothing like frivolous about this. She's planning a future. I think they were even preparing to move out of state once they got married. Like all of that is done. None of it's happening. Like all those plans that were in motion and just waiting for this wedding day came to a screeching halt. Just perspective. So
if you are seriously stuck and not moving forward and can't figure out what your next step is, it might be grief work. Because some of my friends have come to me stuck and we explore, they've known things for years and we explore some things. And then I ask if they've ever done their impact letter, if they've really sat down and looked at their losses. And a lot of times the answer is no, which means they've not grieved. So if you're stuck, if you're wondering what's next, why can't I move on? It could be that you haven't stepped into grief.
Yeah, another thing that could be helpful for our listeners is even just to Google stages of grief to give you a real sense of where you might be able to put yourself on that spectrum. And it is funny because generally you'll find these visuals of stages of grief, but yet your experience is like all over the place. It's like this crazy ping pong ball, right? Because one minute you're in denial, the next minute you have hope, then all of a sudden you're fearing, then you jump into depression, then you hop over to denial again. it's just all over the place. And that could happen within 4 minutes, right? Or sometimes it happens in 4 months. Like, it just kind of depends on where you're at.
Yeah. I landed a lot. I landed a lot in anger, but I also landed in bargaining. Every opportunity for Dave to buy me a gift, he'd ask, "What do you want?" And I'd say, "A time machine. I just want to go back. I want to go back in the very beginning. I want to fix this. I don't want to have to have gone through all of this." That was my bargaining. All right. So to wrap up, we've talked about our personal experiences with grief. We've kind of defined it some, and we've talked about how our clients may experience grief. And you're experiencing grief, the pain of it may be different from all of this, but it's valid. But what we want to go into now is that we want to leave you with some practical tools on how to step into grief, and we want to leave you with some hope. So what do you have to add, Lachelle or Pam?
I'll give you some tools, personal tools. Personal tools for me have been just name it. So I'll give you a quick story. 2 Thanksgivings ago, one of my favorite dishes is sweet potatoes. And I used to share that I had a family member who also that was their favorite dish. So I have these fond memories about going to family events and us bantering over the sweet potatoes, right? Like, who's going to steal the whole casserole dish or the other one? Unfortunately, that relationship with that family member has dissolved. And so I don't get to spend holidays with that person. But I was making sweet potatoes at my house. And I'm making them, and my kids are running all over the place. And it's just like our family tradition for me to make these. I am not conscious of any of this, right? But one of my kids comes in as I'm peeling these sweet potatoes, and they ask me a question, and I just snap off really fast and short. They're kind of taken back a little bit, and then she walks away from me. I kind of catch myself, and I'm like, what in the world was that? Like, that was really harsh. Like, that didn't feel like it didn't match, right? The situation. I took a chance to become self-aware, right? I did a check-in with myself, and I'm like, what's going on? And it clicked. I was grieving the loss of that person and that relationship. But what had triggered it was the sweet potatoes, right? But I was in the throes of grieving and not realizing it. And so one of the stages that they talk about grief is emotional outbursts. And I kind of felt like that was an emotional outburst. Like, I just snapped off with real impatience. She came back in, my daughter came back in, and I turned to her and I said, hey, I'm so sorry that I just got really short with you. I didn't realize, but I'm grieving today and I miss my family. And of course, my daughter being 7, she's like, okay, mom. And she just takes off and does whatever she's doing. But even me saying that out loud was making it real. But it also, there was an element of permission. Like, I could say that I'm doing something, even if I don't like what I'm doing. I gave it space. And I think I heard Pam say something about honor. Like, it created a sense of honor. That's exactly what was happening.
Absolutely. Lament to the Lord. He grieves with you. If you don't take it to him, he can't do it. Also, get into a group. I know I repeat this a lot. The group is a place where you can connect, and your grief, it needs to be seen. It needs to be heard. And it's a safe space to let it all go and let yourself go and crumble if you need to and just cry. You need people to see you grieving. Give yourself permission to fall apart that way. I know I dealt with it also by journaling it. I let all the ick come out, all the cognitive distortions, all the anger, all the feelings, all the feels, the sadness, the loss, the love too, the things that I loved that I'd lost. It's not going to be this way forever. That those emotions and the grief may not leave you completely, but it will certainly change. Your grief won't grow smaller, but you will grow bigger around it.
Other practical tools I'll add to the list, the journaling. I've had clients who tell me that they set a timer for 10 minutes. And so they say to themselves, I'm going to grieve for 10 minutes. And that's it. For them, that feels like it offers them some containment. It helps them navigate through that fear of, if I start, I can't stop. I've had other clients who make a playlist of music, and that is the intention of that playlist. I actually have that for myself. I have a playlist that just makes me think of my grandma and grandpa. And anytime I feel like I'm missing them, I just hit that playlist and I just move through the motions. I just let it happen. And sometimes I cry, sometimes I laugh, sometimes I smile with remembrance. I've had women tell me that they just went and watched a really sad movie because they needed just something to trigger the cry or the emotions, right? Maybe, and not PS, not every woman cries when she grieves, right? You heard me, I snap off at my kids, apparently. It's not necessarily that we're saying, we can't wait for you to be a puddle in the bottom of your shower. Sometimes it's just literally feeling and processing, like Pam was saying with the journaling. So sad movies.
Anything by Nicholas Sparks.
Blah.
Bleh.
Beaches, right? Your best friend dies.
Notebook. Yuck.
I know.
Notebook. So the Notebook is my mom and dad's love story. So that's double whammy. I can't watch Notebook because I don't want to grieve. I don't want to grieve. I admit it. No one wants to grieve. I'll leave this in too. I'll leave this in.
No, I do not want to grieve.
I do not want
to grieve. So
I am
there.
not grieving, says Sam. I am. So I get it if you don't want to do it. I get it. So my grieving, like I said, a lot of it landed in anger. And so to be angry in a responsible manner, and maybe I've said this prior on other episodes, but I listen to heavy metal Christian music. Lachelle laughs all the time.
Visualize that. I don't know.
I know. If you haven't seen me, go look at my picture. I don't look like a heavy metal Christian girl, rapper girl, whatever. I don't look like I listen to.
No, you do not.
Yeah.
None of us do.
It processed that anger through my body. I could feel it in my body, and it was very, I will say, empowering, but it also got it out of me.
Yeah.
It was very visceral. It was very somatic. It was somatic work. It really was.
For me, it's Alanis Morissette, Jagged Little Pill, the whole album.
And it was safe. It was in a safe way. I didn't feel like I didn't have containment. When the song was over, it was kind of like the 10-minute thing. When the song was over, it was over. So that's, if you're landing in anger, that might be a way to help. But
and I know for some people, there's power in ritual. Whether you write a letter to your partner, get it all out, place it in a pile, put some stones around it, and burn it. Or whether you go somewhere that's very meaningful for you and you throw rocks into the sea or rocks into a lake. Each one of those rocks maybe represents something that you're grieving, the past, the man you thought you were married to, the woman you thought you were, the future you thought you were going to have. Something that takes it from the inside, all the thoughts rolling around inside my head, and physically getting them out changes it. So for some people that can be very powerful. Look at, again, we talked about culture. We have rituals and culture that make it real. And the rituals mark the passage from one state to another state. So that might be helpful too.
And I guess the hope I would leave is that if you are afraid of disappearing, if you think that you will just be enveloped by this pain, I just want to let you know that it does lessen through time, the pain. And I will give you my mantra. God will not let the devastation destroy you. He will not. You are in the palm of his hand. He knows what you're going through. Whether you trust him or not, he is trustworthy and he sees you. So if you're there in the midst of it, I just want to give you an encouragement to hang on.
Yeah, I'm going to throw in the word that God gave me in my own wrestle with grief. And it's Psalm 34, verse 17 and 18. And it says, the righteous cry out and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and save those who are crushed in spirit. And when I was telling you all that I was preparing for that summit, this was a scripture that I had looked up and was reading through, trying to look for spiritual purpose with grief. I knew that Jesus grieved at Lazarus' tomb. I knew that even the women cried at the tomb after Jesus had died. I knew that other individuals, other people in the story, I'm thinking about Nehemiah, have grieved, but they were still their stories. And I was trying to look for a directive for me as a person. And so when I read that verse 18, I'll read it again. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. I realized that the longer I avoided or I refused to say I was brokenhearted, like I'm not able to say I'm brokenhearted, right? I can't tell that as the truth. Then the Lord doesn't get to do the second part of that. He doesn't get to save those who are crushed in spirit. I have to come into an understanding that I am brokenhearted. And with that, he has purpose. And I don't know all the purpose. I think the purpose, probably if I had to guess, is he just wants to do life with me. He wants to do life with all of us, right? And it's not that he hopes for pain. He doesn't hope for us to live in this brokenness. He has a plan on the other side of this, but he wants to be in the middle of the brokenness with you just as much as he wants to be laying out the plan. I encourage you just to surrender the fear, the pride, the whatever that word is that's holding you hostage from this experience, and just really consider saying, maybe it's just a short season that I need to be able to say yes to this.
There are gifts on the other side. It was hard for me to see it. If you would have told me this in the midst of it, I would have said, you're crazy. No, thank you. I don't want those gifts. But I just want to encourage you. The sun will shine again. You will feel joy again. You will feel love again. Your grief does have purpose, and there are gifts on the other side.
Well, thank you for joining us today. This topic was heavy, but as you consider grief, we hope that we've been maybe not a bright spot today, but an insightful spot today in your recovery journey. And if you find us helpful, please go to iTunes and either leave a 5-star review or a good rating so that others can find us. And also, we each have groups going on. If you check out our websites, which are all listed in the show notes, you can see what we have to offer and maybe we can help you. So we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Bye. Be well.